He thinks I am rich. The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets, each droplet tracing a path. Down the cracked windows of the small cafe, where I sat alone. Steam curled from the chipped porcelain cup in my hands. And the bitter aroma of coffee, mixed with the damp scent of the city, streets outside. I watched him across the room, leaning casually against the counter, hair slicked back from the drizzle, eyes scanning the crowd, as if searching for someone who might understand him. He didn't notice me at first. Not fully, not until I made the smallest movement, stirring my cup. And then his gaze found me. That brief flicker of recognition was enough to set my chest pounding. He thinks I am rich. The thought twisted inside me like a bitter knot. It wasn't true. Not even close. But it had become my armor, my shield in this cruel little game life had thrown us into. I had been born into nothing, raised in the shadows of dusty streets and cramped apartments where dreams rotted before they could even take root. But he didn't know that. He only saw the quiet confidence, the careful way I carried myself, the way my fingers danced over the rim of my cup, as if I belonged to some world he could never fully touch. I had met him months ago at a gallery opening. A chance encounter, though I tried to convince myself it was fate. He had smiled at me, all charm and warmth. And I had smiled back, knowing how dangerous it was to let him in. He spoke of travel, of investments, of art in ways that made my throat ache, with longing and humiliation all at once. And I had nodded, just nodded, never correcting the image I allowed him to hold. That I lived a life of abundance, free from the shackles of debt, free from the gnawing insecurity that clung to me like a second skin. I had wanted him to see me, truly see me. But fear had silenced that wish. What if he recoiled? What if he laughed when he knew the truth? So I let him believe in the lie, a delicate, glimmering lie that I wrapped around myself like a soft shawl against the cold reality of my life. It wasn't just for him. It was for me too. To pretend, even for a moment, that I could breathe without the weight of poverty pressing down, that I could exist in a world that was not cruel and unrelenting. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and he moved closer, his smile now fully directed at me. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a dangerous warmth that threatened to expose the trembling of my hands. He sat down across from me without asking, as if he owned the space, as if he owned my attention. I didn't expect to see you here, he said, voice low, casual, but with a tremor that betrayed the interest he couldn't hide. I come here sometimes, I replied, forcing my tone to stay neutral, masking the flutter in my chest that was anything but calm. It's quiet. Helps me think. His eyes softened, and I almost felt myself letting go. Almost told him the truth about who I really was. But then, a memory struck me like a cold slap. The night I first decided to let him believe in the lie. The dress I had borrowed from a friend. The makeup carefully applied to erase every hint of exhaustion from my face. the practiced laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone I had never been. That night, I had tasted what it felt like to be wanted, not for who I was, but for what he believed I was. And it had hurt more than any truth ever could. "I like this place," he said after a moment, watching the rain trail down the window behind me. "It feels safe. Like nothing bad can happen in here." I wanted to tell him that nothing outside could ever protect me. That safety was an illusion I could never afford. But the words lodged in my throat, bitter and heavy. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said softly. "It's one of the few places where you can pretend everything is fine." He leaned back, and I saw the faint shadow behind his eyes. The kind of loneliness I knew too well. But it was different from mine. His was wrapped in wealth, privilege, expectations he could never admit were burdensome. Mine was raw, knowing, a constant reminder that I was surviving on scraps while everyone else danced in abundance. And yet, here we were, two people inhabiting the same small cafe, separated by invisible walls of truth and lies, our lives entangled in a fragile dance neither of us fully understood. He reached across the table, brushing a wet strand of hair from my face. His hand was warm, familiar, and yet it carried a weight that made my heart ache. I wanted to pull away, to protect him from the truth, from the reality I could never reveal. But the lie had grown too strong. It had roots now, and if I pulled it out too suddenly, everything would crumble. Everything, including him. "I wish I could stay like this forever," he said quietly. "Just you and me, no expectations, no worries." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. If only he knew how fragile this moment truly was. If only he knew the nights I went hungry to save a few dollars. The apartment that smelled of mildew and lost dreams, the endless work I did just to keep the illusion intact. He couldn't know. He must never know. "I wish that too," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the rain. "But the world, it doesn't really allow it, does it?" He shook his head, a shadow of understanding passing over his features. But he didn't ask for more. He never would. And maybe that was for the best. Sometimes silence was a gift, a way to let the lie live a little longer, without being suffocated by reality. I wanted to tell him that I was nothing like he thought I was. That my life was a patchwork of compromises and sacrifices, stitched together with hope that refused to die. But I couldn't. So I let him think the lie. And as I watched him leave, disappearing into the rain with that careless confidence, I felt a pang of guilt that cut deeper than any blade. He thinks I am rich. And maybe, in that fleeting illusion, I am. But as the cafe door closed behind him, leaving only the sound of rain and my own ragged breathing, I knew that the lie was a fragile thing. And lies, no matter how beautiful, always have a way of breaking. He had always been a mystery to me. A quiet presence that lingered on the edges of my life, never fully stepping in, yet impossible to ignore. Even now, as I sat on the worn sofa of my tiny apartment, the dim light from the single bulb casting long shadows across the room, I could feel his memory pressing against my chest, heavy and suffocating. I wondered if he remembered that night as vividly as I did. If, like everyone else, he had moved on, leaving the fragments of us scattered and forgotten. The day he left had started like any other, with the faint hum of the city outside and the smell of rain lingering in the air. I had seen him at the cafe we frequented, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on mine, a flash of recognition. Or was it hesitation? Passing through them, I had smiled. The kind of smile that promised warmth, a smile that hid the ache that had been growing inside me for months. He had come over, our usual conversation beginning in its familiar rhythm. Yet there was a tension, a distance I could not bridge. I could see the unspoken words, trapped behind his eyes, the questions he didn't dare to ask. And I felt my own defenses rising, building walls I thought would protect me from the inevitable hurt. "You've changed," he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if afraid that speaking would shatter the fragile connection we still shared. I laughed softly, a hollow sound that seemed to echo through the empty cafe. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. He frowned, leaning back in his chair, and for a moment, the world around us faded. I could feel the gravity of his presence, the way it pulled at something deep inside me, stirring a longing I had tried to bury. I wanted to tell him everything. The loneliness, the struggle, the nights spent wondering if he would ever truly see me. But the words caught in my throat. How could I explain that my life was nothing like he imagined? That the comfort he associated with me was an illusion, built on quiet smiles and careful gestures. "I don't know who you are anymore," he admitted, the vulnerability in his voice making my chest ache. "I'm still me," I whispered, barely audible, afraid that if I spoke any louder, I would crumble entirely. "I'm just harder to understand now." The rain outside began to fall in heavier sheets, drumming against the window in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. I wanted to reach across the table, to grab his hand and hold on, to make him stay just a little longer. But the weight of our unspoken truths kept me frozen. Instead, I watched him, tracing the lines of his face, as if memorizing them, knowing that soon this memory would be all I had left. He stood then, abruptly, as if the decision had been made long before he spoke. "I have to go," he said. And there was no hesitation, no plea for me to follow. Only the quiet resignation of someone who had given up on what could never truly be. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I understand," I managed, though I did not really. The moment he left, the silence in the apartment was deafening. The echoes of his footsteps lingered, haunting the empty rooms, a reminder of the warmth that had once been there and was now gone. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, letting the tears flow freely at last. The sorrow I had tried to contain for so long pouring out in a quiet, devastating wave. Days turned into nights, and nights into a blur of memories and regrets. I found myself retracing every word, every glance, every fleeting touch, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Did he ever truly care? Or had he loved only the image of me he had built in his mind, a version of myself I had never been able to sustain? I began to avoid the places we had once gone, afraid that the sight of a familiar cafe table or a rain-streaked street would reopen wounds that were only just beginning to scab over. Yet no matter how far I ran, his presence lingered, woven into the fabric of my life in ways I could not escape. One evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the bridge where we had first met, the city lights shimmering in the water below, distorted and broken. I closed my eyes and let the wind whip around me, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the ghost of his cologne. I whispered his name into the darkness, as if calling to him might bring him back, and felt the hollow ache of absence settle into my bones. I remembered the lies I had told, the little pretenses that had built a life he believed in, but I knew was false. I had let him think I was secure, untroubled, wealthy in ways that were only illusions. I had allowed him to see the surface, while the undercurrents of my reality remained hidden. And now, the weight of that deception pressed upon me, heavier than any heartbreak could ever be. Perhaps he had seen through it all. Perhaps that was why he had gone. The thought was unbearable. Yet there was a small part of me that understood, could even forgive him for walking away. But the larger, more desperate part of me wanted to scream at him to stay, to fight for the fragile connection we had, to look beyond the lies and see the real me waiting underneath. I lingered on the bridge until the city below blurred into shadows, the lights dimming as the night deepened. And as I turned to leave, I realized that some wounds are not meant to heal quickly, that some losses are not meant to be forgotten. The ache in my chest would remain, a constant reminder of what I had loved and lost, of the man who had thought I was rich, and the truth that I was merely human, fragile, and achingly alone. The rain had stopped by the time I reached my apartment, leaving the streets slick and shining in the muted glow of street lamps. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring at the reflections of a life that seemed just out of reach. And in that quiet, fractured moment, I understood that love, no matter how deep, cannot always bridge the chasms of expectation, illusion, and truth. I sank into my bed, wrapping myself in the thin comfort of blankets, letting the silence of the night become a lullaby for my sorrow. Tomorrow, the world would continue as if nothing had changed, but I would carry the weight of him, the memory, the ache, the unspoken truths, like a secret wound that no one could see, but that would always bleed. And somewhere, out there, he was moving on. Perhaps never realizing the depth of what he had left behind. Never understanding that the richest things are not always made of gold, but of the fragile hearts that dare to love despite knowing the inevitable pain. The days blurred together after he left, each one a mirror of the one before. Marked only by the relentless hum of the city, outside my window, and the echo of his absence inside my chest. I walked the streets alone, feeling the hollow spaces in my life that his presence had once filled. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of him in the reflections of shop windows, a phantom wearing my imagination like a second skin, and my heart would lurch as though it still believed he was near. Work had become a refuge and a torment all at once. I spent long hours at the boutique, arranging displays and serving customers with a smile that felt increasingly like a mask. Beneath it, my mind wandered to him. The way he had looked at me, as though I were something untouchable. The way his hand had brushed mine. Casual yet electric. A touch I would carry in memory long after the warmth faded. And then the lies, the truth I had never told him, pressed against my ribs like a cage. I could not escape. I had convinced myself that I was protecting him by not revealing the reality of my life. But now, the act felt like betrayal. Each lie was a brick in a wall that separated us. And every day I built it higher. He had believed in an illusion, and in doing so, he had loved something I could never truly give. That thought alone was a quiet, persistent torment, gnawing at the edges of my mind until sleep became a distant memory. One evening, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gray, I found myself drawn back to the cafe, where it all began. It smelled the same, coffee and rain, faintly of old wood polish. And I took a seat in the corner, the very one where he had sat across from me months ago. I cradled a warm cup between my hands, trying to summon the courage to face the memory, rather than run from it. He wasn't there, of course. How could he be? And yet, I felt his presence, as if it had been stitched into the very fabric of the room. I remembered the way his gaze had lingered on me, the way he had leaned in close, voice soft yet deliberate, sharing fragments of himself that I could never claim as mine. He had been so close, yet so far, and I had let the distance grow with my silence, with my careful concealment of the truth. The door opened, and the sound made me start. A couple entered, laughing, the man's hand resting lightly on the woman's back. I smiled faintly at their joy, and a bitter pang shot through me. That should have been me with him, I thought. But the truth clawed at me. It could never be, not when the foundations of what he believed were built on lies. I remembered the night after he left, when I had cried until my throat ached and my pillow was damp with tears. I had whispered to the darkness, imagining his hand reaching for mine, imagining him asking the questions I could never answer. I had longed for the honesty, for the reckoning that might have given us a chance to rebuild something real. But honesty had always been my enemy in that story. Weeks passed, and the seasons shifted subtly. Autumn crept in with a chill that made the city feel heavier, more somber. I found myself walking past his apartment building without meaning to, staring at the windows that might hold his silhouette, hoping, foolishly, that he would appear, that he would somehow still notice me in a way that mattered. I hated myself for it, for the desperation that clung to me like a shadow. But it was a craving I could not suppress. It was then, on a particularly cold evening, that I ran into someone who knew him, an acquaintance from one of his gallery visits. She smiled brightly, oblivious to the storm inside me, and mentioned casually that he had been traveling, investing in a new venture, moving as if the world could bend itself around him. My stomach dropped. He was alive, thriving, indifferent to the absence that had hollowed me out. And in that indifference, I felt a deep, aching loneliness that threatened to consume me entirely. I walked home through the empty streets, the wind cutting through my thin coat, carrying with it the scent of wet asphalt and fading leaves. I thought of calling him, of breaking the walls I had built, but the fear of rejection, of shattering the delicate memory of us that still lingered, stopped me. It was safer, I realized, to let him exist in the illusion I had created, to let him think me rich, stable, untouchable, rather than show him the cracks that ran deep through my soul. Night after night, I sat by the window, staring at the city lights, blurred by rain or fog, imagining him walking those same streets without ever crossing my path again. I whispered his name into the dark, a prayer, a confession, a plea that went unanswered. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, a reminder that I was living a life half-formed, shaped by the weight of what I could not give and could not ask for. And yet, despite the despair, there was a stubborn flicker of hope. Hope that perhaps he might remember. Hope that the bond we had shared in fleeting moments could resurface. But hope was a dangerous companion, cruel and unrelenting, because it demanded faith in the impossible. And I had learned, slowly and painfully, that love without truth was a fragile thing, always on the edge of collapse. I touched the glass with my fingertips, pressing against the cold surface, as if reaching across time and space could bring him closer. The city hummed around me, indifferent, unyielding, and I shivered. In that silence, I made a quiet vow to myself. No matter the years, no matter the distance, I would carry the memory of him. His laugh, his gaze, the warmth of his hand, like a precious, painful treasure. It was mine alone, and perhaps that was all it could ever be. In the stillness of that night, I understood that some love stories are not meant for endings of joy, not for the comfort of happy reunions. They exist instead in the spaces between moments, in the achy of memory, in the quiet heartbreak of what might have been. And for me, that knowledge was both a curse and a solace, a constant reminder that even in the absence of him, even in the lie I had lived, I had loved deeply, truly, and irrevocably. The winter settled over the city like a heavy, suffocating blanket, making every step on the icy sidewalks feel like a reminder of how alone I had become. The streets glistened under the faint glow of street lamps, their reflections fractured in puddles frozen by the night. I wandered aimlessly, my coat wrapped tightly around me. But it did little to ward off the chill that had seeped into my bones. His memory was with me constantly, a ghost I could neither shake nor embrace. I remembered the day I had finally accepted that he would never return. Not because he didn't care, but because he had never truly known me. The realization had been like a cold wave crashing over my heart, leaving it battered, raw, and exposed. Every smile, every conversation we had shared, every laugh that had rung in my ears, now felt like a delicate lie I had been complicit in telling. He had loved the idea of me, the version I presented, not the one who had counted every penny, who had stared at peeling paint on her walls, and wondered if she could survive another month. My apartment felt smaller than ever that night. The walls, once a comforting barrier, now pressed in on me like a cage. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the shadows cast by the single flickering bulb, the silence of the room only broken by the faint hum of the radiator. I reached for my journal, the pages worn and smudged from my constant writing, my only outlet for the storm that raged inside. Why does it hurt so much? I whispered to the blank page, my words barely audible. Why does it ache to remember someone who never truly saw me? The pen trembled in my hand as I wrote, tracing the contours of memories that were both beautiful and unbearable. I wrote of the laughter we had shared, the gentle teasing, the stolen glances that felt like confessions. And I wrote of the lies, the careful constructions of wealth and stability that had kept him interested while isolating me in a world of quiet desperation. I wrote until my hand ached, until the words blurred and bled together, until my tears soaked the ink and left the page illegible. It was in that writing, in the messy, raw confessions I could never voice aloud, that I began to see the truth of myself. I was not rich, not in money or comfort. But I was rich in something far more painful and precious, the capacity to love, to hope, to create beauty out of the fragments of a broken life. And yet, even that richness felt hollow, because it had been invisible to the one I had loved, unnoticed, unappreciated, mistaken for something else entirely. The days bled together into weeks, and the weight of my solitude became a constant companion. I walked past galleries and cafes, avoiding the spaces that might hold memories of him, yet unable to resist the pull of their familiarity. I would catch myself imagining him there, sitting across from me, smiling that easy smile that had once disarmed me, and my chest would tighten with a mixture of longing and despair. Then one evening, as I wandered through the narrow streets near the river, I heard a voice I knew before I saw him. My heart leaped, and for a moment, I thought the years had been erased. That time had folded in on itself to give me one more chance. But as I turned the corner, I saw him walking with another woman, his hand resting lightly on her back, his laughter mingling with hers. The sight was unbearable, a knife twisting in my chest. I turned away, retreating into the darkness, feeling the icy wind cut through me, like reality itself had conspired to remind me of my solitude. And yet, amidst the pain, a strange clarity settled over me. He had moved on. And in doing so, he had freed me from the fragile illusions that had kept me bound to him. The love I had carried, the hope I had nurtured, it belonged to me now. Not to him. Not to the lies, not to the past. I walked through the empty streets for hours, letting the silence and cold press against me, until I felt hollowed out, cleansed in a way that only heartbreak could achieve. By the time I returned to my apartment, the first light of dawn was brushing the sky, in muted tones of pink and gray. I opened the window, letting the crisp air fill the room, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I had thought lost possibility. I understood, in that quiet dawn, that the life I had lived, the struggles, the lies, the moments of fleeting joy, had shaped me in ways no love or loss could erase. I was still fragile, still human, still aching, but I was also stronger, tempered by the pain and the beauty of what I had felt. And though he had believed in a version of me that never existed, I would carry the truth within me unbroken, unyielding, a secret I would guard fiercely. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes as the sun's first rays warmed my face. The city stirred below, indifferent and unrelenting. But for the first time, I felt a measure of peace. The love I had given, the pain I had endured, the life I had lived, they were mine, entirely mine. And perhaps that was enough. Even as the memory of him lingered, even as the ache persisted, I began to see that the world still held moments of unexpected beauty. Moments where hope could blossom amidst sorrow. I would not allow the absence of one man, no matter how beloved, to define the rest of my life. I opened my journal once more, pen poised over the page, and wrote not of loss, not of longing, but of the quiet resilience that had carried me through the storm. I wrote of small victories, of the fleeting warmth of sunlight on my face, of the laughter of strangers that could lift the heaviest heart. And in that act, I felt a shift, subtle but profound. The beginning of a life reclaimed, a self rediscovered, a future that, for the first time in years, felt just within reach. The spring arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, bringing with it the faint scent of blossoms and the soft hum of life stirring once more. The city, which had seemed cold and indifferent for so long, now glimmered with the promise of renewal. I found myself walking the familiar streets with a lighter step, my coat no longer a shield against the world, but a mere companion, my heart still carrying the memory of him, but no longer weighed down by the lie I had lived. I had returned to the cafe, the place that had once been both sanctuary and prison. The windows were streaked with sunlight, the scent of coffee warm and comforting, rather than a trigger for sorrow. I took my usual corner seat and ordered a cup. My hands steady, my thoughts clear. For the first time in years, I felt I could be present in the moment without the ache of what had been lost clawing at me. He had faded into the background of my life, no longer a shadow haunting my days. The realization had come slowly, like the gentle erosion of sand against stone. And it left behind a strange clarity. He had never truly known me, and yet, in the brief time we had shared, he had stirred something deep within me, something that had taught me the depth of my own heart, the capacity for longing, for love, and for resilience. I looked out the window and watched people pass by. Couples walking hand in hand, strangers laughing as they hurried along, children chasing the wind across the street. I felt a pang, a fleeting ache for what could have been, but it was gentle now, a memory softened by time. My own reflection in the glass no longer looked like a fragile, lonely figure. It looked like someone who had endured, who had loved and survived, who had emerged from the storm with a heart still capable of hope. Life had begun to settle into a rhythm that was entirely my own. I worked hard, not for appearances or to maintain a lie, but for myself. For the small joys, the modest comforts, the sense of independence that I had always craved. I nurtured friendships that had been neglected, reaching out to those who had remained steadfast through my quiet despair. And slowly, the loneliness that had once defined me began to ease, replaced by a profound sense of self, possession, and quiet pride. Yet, there were moments, rare, fleeting, when I would catch a glimpse of him, perhaps in a crowd or in the reflection of a window, and my heart would flutter with an old, familiar ache. But now, I did not chase it, did not yearn for the impossible. I let it exist as a ghost, a reminder of a chapter that had shaped me, and nothing more. The love I had carried for him was no longer a chain, but a memory, precious and intact, preserved without pain or expectation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the city, I walked along the riverbank, where I had once stood lost in longing. The water shimmered with the reflection of the sky, each ripple catching the light like fragments of a broken dream, now mended. I paused, letting the wind caress my face, and felt a sense of completion settle over me. I had mourned, I had hoped, I had loved, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength I had never known. I realized then that love does not always come with possession, that sometimes it is meant to teach, to shape, to guide us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves. He had been a part of my story, a chapter I would always remember. But the narrative was mine to continue, mine to write, mine to live fully. The ache had softened into a quiet reverence, a recognition of what had been beautiful, even in its impermanence. I turned away from the river and walked toward the heart of the city, the streets alive with the soft murmur of life. The buildings, the people, the sounds. All of it seemed vibrant, filled with possibility. And in that moment, I understood that wealth is not measured in possessions or status, but in the depth of experience, in the courage to love and to endure, in the capacity to rise after loss and still embrace life with an open heart. The lie that had once bound me, the idea that I was rich, that I was untouchable, had fallen away. What remained was truth, my truth, fragile yet resilient, sorrowful yet beautiful, and entirely my own. And as I stepped into the bustle of the evening, feeling the pulse of the city beneath my feet, I carried with me a quiet certainty. I had survived heartbreak. I had endured loneliness, and I had loved deeply. And in that, I was richer than I had ever been. In every way that truly mattered.